tonight, we've got probably the best researched speech I've ever heard of. Erwin Steward and Sheriff Bethany Wood is here. You can see that.
Can't hear him.
Yeah.
Turn up your hearing aid.
Move up to the front row.
Yeah, Russ.
Back here. 4 rounds, 5 rounds.
But before that, we have some very important business. We have a sign-up sheet.
Get a speaker system for the gym.
We have a sign-up sheet back there for Saturday night. As you know, we're having our corned beef dinner, which is sold out, by the way. Can't get you any more tickets. But, Saturday. No, but there's a sign-up sheet for anybody that would like to make a buy or something along those lines. But without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Erwin. Thank you.
See if this works. Yeah, sounds like it's working. Usually you start out by expressing your thanks to lots of people, which I will do. But tonight I'm going to start by eating crow. It seems that 2 of my neighbors I inadvertently neglected to include on the timeline. What I attempted to do was to go to each piece of property from when it was first purchased by Howell in 1936, take it through all the various owners to the present times.
Thanks very much.
And I inadvertently left Lester out, and I left Gloria out. Now, Gloria's only lived there for 40 years. 41 years. But Gloria, I was trying to think of why I did this, and it was Sin City. What can I tell you? I would like to express my thanks to a short group of people. Rose Marco and Debbie Russell, Nancy McCarthy, and June Lally, all of whom are obviously in the town hall front office, and they have been very helpful to me in doing my research in the vault. Needless to say, none of this would happen without Bob Britton. I also want to thank Dave Hungerford. Dave was instrumental in trying to help me get in touch with Mr. Howell's granddaughter. Dave, did you go to college with her, is that right?
Grammar school.
Grammar school, okay. And tried something. He kept researching and we kept coming up with different ways to get hold of her. Unfortunately, we didn't because I never met the gentleman. I have no photographs of him. And I wish I had been able to talk to her. She would have been able to clear up a few odds and ends. And then I want to thank Carol and Ed. Carol was Ed Fletcher? Okay. And Carol, I'm going to mispronounce it. Candiano. Carol gave me an article that was written in the Architectural Record in one in 1935, one in 1936, and I was able to go down to Yale and get photocopies of those, and they're all part of the record. So I hope that that should just about get us started. I'm not sure why this keeps turning itself off. Maybe it won't once we get started. The very first record that we have in reference to, or what will be eventually the Bethany Wood, was a letter on April 17th, 1933 from Mr. Howell to a Karina Mortimer in New Haven. And let me see if we can just click through this. Most of these things, by the way, you don't necessarily have, if you can't read them up here, don't worry because it's all duplicated around the room. And this, he wrote and said, "Dear Madam, you may be interested in an effort that is being made to get together several families of culture and suitable means to form a resident park near New Haven. The intention is not only to restrict the membership, but also to plan unified and harmonious growth without ostentation or extravagance. The intent is in its early stages and suggestions are welcome. The writer would appreciate an opportunity at your convenience to learn what you might think of the idea." We then go on, that was April. And then in July, there's a second letter, it's 1933. It says, "Dear Matt, this is to, it looks like it's Lester, but it's Mrs. Lester C. Richardy? I'm not sure. Anyway, also New Haven, the house shown in the catalog will probably not will not suit you, but it will give you an idea of what could be done. If you buy a house, it is largely, anyway, you can read it up there. This is hard for me to read. But then it goes on, and this is the interesting part to me. It said, Mr. I'm sorry?
You're channeling some other noise.
Oh, somebody else is coming in?
Yeah.
Oh. Hopefully that won't happen very long. Mr. Whitlock will give you a concession in the price of the land for the first 2 or 3 houses. He will make a further concession to anyone who will agree to begin to build within a few months. Furthermore, he will take bookstore stock in part payment for the land, and so on. And the thing that was interesting to me on that little note was in 1931, Mr. Howell evidently loaned, this Whitlock is Clifford Whitlock, evidently loaned him some money, and there were 20 acres of land on Sperry Road that were used as collateral. And then about 1934, 35, someplace in there, he foreclosed on that land and ended up owning 20 acres of land on Sperry Road. And then several years later, he turns around and he sells it back to Clifford Whitlock. So this is what he's referring to, the Whitlock he's talking about. He has there are other references to Mr. Howell in the early 30s where he is loaning money to people in Bethany, usually with land as collateral. We then move on to, this is just a general map that Bob gave me, an overall view of everything in Bethany. Oh boy. It's absolutely I haven't had a chance to adjust it. So, hopefully, before it gets used in public meeting. This is the piece of property we're talking about right here. And if you'll notice the big bend in Woods in Rainbow Road, we have it all to
Because you talk loud.
that's exactly what I'm going to do.
I just haven't had a chance. I've been so busy doing everything else. I'll just raise my voice. This is Rainbow Road through here, and at the time this map was made, it did not go through. Above that is Perkins Road, which indicates it goes all the way through, but it never did. And then, if this is Carrington, and if you stand here at the top of Carrington Hill and look down, you will see that it goes absolutely straight up toward Prospect. I just found that map very interesting. This is we zoom in on it, and you will notice it's Smith School, which is still in existence, and it's that one little house that's on Carrington Road, just as before you get up to Bethany Wood. This is a drawing or layout I did indicating who owned what land in 1936. This is all New Haven Water Company. This was the Smith School. This was a piece of property owned by the Harrisons. There's the cemetery. There are two pieces here, and I ran out of time in trying to figure out who owned them. And this piece here was owned by Minnie McCoy Downs, and that piece of property was sold to George Vail in 1937 or 38. So this is the area, and this piece here is what was sold to Mr. Howell by Tyler Davidson. And then this is the concept that Mr. Howell had, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because we'll run out of time. But it is kind of a wooded tract of 50 acres on the outskirts of New Haven is being developed by J. Cox Howell as a small year-round colony for 10 or 12 congenial families with a common background of cultural interests. The site is an elevation of 600 feet, has a southerly exposure with extensive views over the surrounding country. The express motorway from New York to Boston proposed by the Regional Planning Board is intended to pass through Bethany Gap. Now, I'm not quite sure if that is where the tunnel is. It certainly would not have come all the way up here, I don't think. A road has been surveyed to the east end of the site and a well is now being drilled for water. 3 houses designed by Some Lafarge architect are in process of construction and will provide comforts and convenience on a scale with the yearly incomes of $4,000 to $6,000, and then it goes on beyond that. And then that letter is
Over here on this side, it's on this side.
it's over there. So, yeah, it's the very first letter over there. The interesting thing is this again is in spring of 1935. And these are 2 maps that are part of that. And there's a little note here that says deep well. And if you look, you will notice that the intent was for Woods Road. There's Carrington. There's Woods Road. And it is to go over and come out onto Rainbow Road and also to come out on Litchfield Turnpike. It was a very interesting concept. That never happened. The map that was more interesting to me was this one. All at the same time, 1935. And there are little notes in here which are hard to read from here, but if you look at the map, you'll see this is called the Bridle Patch. And that's the area, that's the piece of property that I own. Below that is a little piece here called Oh Be Lonely. And that eventually became Foursquare. The clearing became the stone house. Ledges are the ledges. They still exist. Everybody refers to the ledges as such. The boulder was never built. Thank you, Mr. Gates. Then we go up. Then this one is Tuckaway, which exists today. High Corner was never, and this is Sunspot. This is Rainbow's End, Potable, and this just says Council Bluffs. So this was 1935. Whether this was Mr. Howell's idea to name these pieces of property or whether it was the architect, we have no way of knowing. I think it was probably, I'm guessing it was Mr. Howell because it continues on in the future. That's redundant. Okay. We've seen these 2. This is the piece of property after Mr. Howell buys it. Again, this is all water company. This is what Mr. Howell owns. This is the Vale property, the cemetery, 2 unknowns, and the schoolhouse. This is the same, slightly different colors, but it shows where Bethany Wood is, Bethany Wood Road is. And this is a right-of-way for the power company, and there's another right-of-way along there for the power company to get power into the wells. This map is dated. This is, is over here. There are many, many copies of this map. And it says, well, it goes up to 1939. I'm not sure when it was actually drawn because I know that Gordon bought this property from Hull in 1940. So the map had to be drawn after 1940. And now you're looking at, none of these houses have names on them. They're all indicated there. The power comes in, there's a well there, and there's a well down here. And there's the garage. This is, the next few pages are an article that appeared in the May issue, 1936 of the Architectural Record, and they are over there on the wall. You can read all of those. And it goes into a great deal of explanation of what they want and so on. But what's interesting is, if you look at these houses, now this one looks like it's done sometime in the summertime. This is Foursquare. This is the house that Dr. Marie Brown lives in today. But it's obviously almost completed, but there are leaves on the trees. If you go to, and this is a close-up of the same one. This is the layout of the house. Now this is the ledges, and here there are no leaves on the tree. So it's a different time of the year. You can see construction material in the front yard. We don't know exactly when it was built because there are no records, building records back then. And this is another one of the ledges. This is the other thing, if you look at this very closely, and if you look at the photograph of the ledges today, there is a major portion of the house that was not part of this. And the house, the land was purchased by a family by the name of Russell, Helen and Blake, I believe it was. And they added what everyone referred to as the great room. And here's a photograph over here of the interior of the great room. And that was the big party room as the kids got older. But when the kids were younger, that's where they would play. And Timer was telling me that as a kid, he used to go over there and play basketball with the Russell boys inside that room. That was all added later. And then I talked to Janie McKenzie, who is the younger daughter of Sandy and Betty McKenzie, on the phone. She sent me some photographs, which we'll get to later in the program. And she was telling me that the original great room was not attached to the main house, and it was her father, Sandy McKenzie, who actually made that addition between, so that right now it's all one continuous piece of property. This is the stone house. The stone house was, all of these original houses have some interesting tales to tell. This appears for the first time on the tax records of 1937, and it notes unfinished. Then it appears on the tax record of 1938, unfinished. 39, unfinished. 40, it's finished. Did somebody live in it? We don't know. We don't know where Mr. Howell lived, but we're pretty sure he did live in Bethany, but we don't know where. This is the garage, which is the garage. That part is there, but it's been converted to another room in the house. And when I first moved there in 1960, and I don't know how long preceding my arrival in Bethany, Betty Wolf, the Wolfs owned the residence at that time. Betty Wolf would go down to to the post office box, the mailbox at the corner of Bethany Wood Road in Carrington, get all the mail for all the Bethany Wood residents. She would take it up to the garage where there were pigeonholes and sort it all out. And then when you would come by in the evening, you would stop, say hello to Betty, and pick up your mail and go on home. And that went on for many, many years. How many, I don't know, because it started in '60 and it didn't stop until we got numbers on our houses, and I don't know when that was, I don't remember. But it was sometime in the '60s, I think, if anybody remembers.
Lori, when I moved in, we didn't have numbers, and I believe I had mailbox on my name.
It may have been, but I know when I was there in '60, we were still going up and picking it up, but I don't remember when that changed. But that was kind of like typical of Bethany Wood. It was not unusual for that kind of event to take place.
We got a house number after 1976 because my daughter wrote back to college. And we had 103 on the mailbox. She didn't like it.
I just don't remember. I think,
At least 1976 or maybe over there.
well, evidently they must have told us that we all had to have our own mailboxes at some point in time. But the interesting thing was, that was the Bethany Wood Post Office. These just layouts of the room. This is the tax record from 1937, and Mr. Howell owned a lot of property, and he also owned several residences. And the question is, since none of them had numbers, and you were the tax assessor, how did you know what you were assessing? Well, very simple. You have an assessment on the stone house for $4,000. Then you have see over, you have tuck away is $6,000, and new is $3,000. So all from 1937 on, all the houses were given names. And that was the only way that the tax collectors could possibly figure out who owned what or where. And it went on through there. Then it says see over, let me see if I did the other side. No, this is the following year. And it says the stone house again. It says tuck away the mite box. Now the mite box is in 1938. And many of us thought that the house across the street, what was known as the hidden house, was built before the mite box, but it's not. It's the other way around. We were the first. And let's see if I was smart enough. Oh, then right below that is hidden house. And then this is the back of the chart, and this is what the tax collector had written. It says stone house unfinished, same as last year. 1.54 acres of land. The brick house, new, 1.5 acres of land, tuck away. Concrete block and frame house, 1/4 acre. No question about what house they're talking about. Land, and then it says small. And then finally, the stucco garage near the entrance. So, if it weren't for the tax records and naming things, we have no idea what was built when or who built it. But notice that all of these houses are in Mr. Howell's name. Now, we have no way of knowing who was living in those houses. He obviously didn't live in all 4 houses. But he was obviously renting to people during that period of time. We have no record, couldn't figure out. I was hoping I might be able to go to CL&P and maybe they might have some records to tell me who was paying the electricity then, but I ran out of time. And then this is from 1949, and this is the only place where I have been able to find embers. And let me see if they say that says, this, again, Mr. Howell owns this, and it's 2 acres in embers, a private garage, which is, again, the garage that's down at the corner of Bethany Wood Road, still there today. and then he has a couple of trucks. And for a while I was confused because I didn't know for sure whether the Embers was built before what we got to know as the Divine House, because I had no way of knowing that. But because of the size of the lot, it became obvious that the Embers is the house that is right at the top of the loop, and that's where the Marie and Jeff Boyd lived today. It's right at the top, just as before you get up to Gloria's, it's right there. And then I read, this one was the one that really blew me away. Because this is 1952. And I'm looking through and it says, new, not habitable on October 1st, and it has the cave. I had never heard this. Had you, Lester?
No, never.
This is the Divine House.
The cave?
The cave.
Who's the Divine House now?
The cave.
Way up
The Allens.
Tish and David.
Tish and David Allen live up in the, and it's like, wow. I mean, there are little things that you discover as you're going through looking at the records that really made it very exciting. This is a series of photographs that Janie McKenzie sent to me. This is Ted and Betty Wolf, I believe. These are the Fullers, or the, I'm not sure who these people were. It looks happy. That's, in the middle of that group of women is Littlefield. That's Ted Littlefield. That's Trudy. I think that's Betty. And I think I was negligent in bringing those. I was intended to bring the stuff that she sent me and it's got. So I can't tell you who all of these people are. But then I just got these last weekend. This is Ken Littlefield. They always had very large dogs. This is what Howell really had envisioned when he laid this thing out. And the first people who moved into Bethany Wood, they really did kind of fit into his vision of what he expected the woods to be like. And they are out with horses and skiing up and down the woods road. Didn't have to worry about putting sand on the road because the horses would pull you on. This photograph, I mean, she looks like she's maybe 12. This is Meg Little. Little? Not Littlefield. No, Little. Ed and Meg Little lived in the Foursquare before it was sold to Marie Brown. And he was a scientist and was involved in designing antenna for satellites. And they had a child, and while they lived here, then there was a young girl, and she died while they were living here, and she did not want to leave Bethany. So they split up. He went on up to either Harvard or MIT, and she continued living here until about 1964 or 65. And then she remarried, and then eventually moved back south, because they're both from either Alabama or Mississippi, someplace in the deep south. Well, I have to tell you an interesting little tidbit about her. We were having a party, and everybody brought stuff, and she brought stuffed mushrooms, which were absolutely out of this world. So I asked her if she would give me the recipe, and she was very kind and very gracious and said yes. And then another Southern woman who was also Dudley, Miriam Dudley, who lived in town for many years, also from that same part of the country, she came up to me afterwards and she said, I wouldn't try to make those if I were you. And I said, why? I said, tradition is you always leave out one of the ingredients. This is Foursquare. This is Ted and Betty, and obviously from Ted's hairdo, you can tell this is some kind of a costume party. Again, these people I don't know, but I'm unfamiliar. This was the ice skating rink that was directly across the street from Tuckaway. It was in Ed Civitello's front yard until he filled it in.
That was wetlands.
That was wetlands.
He knew it.
This, I'm not sure. I think this is, whether this is Sandy or I think this is Sandy. Okay. Now, this is the way Bethany Wood Road was maintained. And I kid you not, because Mel Lester was telling me about it. The men would get out in the summertime with the brushes, sweep the sand off, push the road back to the side because the
So why doesn't that happen anymore?
kept being encroached upon by undergrowth, and then they would come in and oil it, and that was good for another year. This is the oldest structure in Bethany Wood. It's also that structure right there. It was originally owned by Tyler Davidson. It was down at Davidson's Corners. Sandy McKenzie bought it and moved it up into Bethany Wood. And this is a photograph. It was Civitello's, but now it's on Howard's property. It's right on the line. But that was, I mean, this to me, this photograph was absolutely marvelous because I knew it when I first moved there as Sandy McKenzie's barn, and it was in McKenzie's meadow or pasture. And then the Civitellos came in and they bought it, and then to find out its origin was just, and I think Timer told me that's the reason that I knew it came from Davidson's Corner was because of him. It's nice to have older people. This is obviously, it goes without saying, another story that Janie McKenzie told me was evidently one winter, it was a very, very snowy day. It's kind of like today. And so a group of them got in the sleigh and they drove into New Haven, into Westville, to go to a function, a party, a restaurant, a bar, who knows. And evidently they stayed quite a while. And then they decided to come home, and by then the snow had all melted off the highway, and they had to leave the sled there and then go back and get with the truck the next day. This is Trudy and Mel Lester, and they are sitting in Carol's front room. This is the McKenzie house. And now we're back at the beginning, I think. Oh, okay, I have two of those. Don't know who these two were. She seemed to think that I think that's Sandy, but I'm not either Sandy or Littlefield, and that was Ruth Littlefield. Ruthie? I think it's Ruthie. This is just a photograph, just a layout of what the area looks like today. I think the resident who lives in that piece of property right there is attending this lecture, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
I was looking for a reaction. I didn't get one.
The second one, it would be the second block.
Yeah, this is the same thing with. Are you in the second? Anyway, this is a.
One over from Vale.
I'm sorry.
One south of Vales.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
This was a piece of 3.5 by 5 card that I found in the records, and again, it refers to the embers, and it says 1.9 acres, and then it says something of sale to Fuller. So once I knew where Fuller's ultimately lived, so it wasn't difficult for me to determine what embers were, and that means that the cave can only be one thing, and that's the divine property. And then these are just large photographs. And this is with all of the dimensions on it today. And then we go back to the beginning. What I'd like to do now is to go through very briefly, if I can, how much time have I got?
As much as you want.
As much as you want.
This is a timeline that I made up. And what I did was I started looking in the records, and I started with Howell. And I looked at every time that Howell either purchased or sold a piece of property from until that point in time when he was no longer involved in the project. So the very first one was Howell, James C. Howell purchases land from Tyler Davidson. And over here we have January 1936. Now remember, as we were looking through these photographs, there were photographs that appeared that there were buildings built in Bethany Wood prior to 1936 because the article in the architectural record was in May. And you've got to figure there are 2 or 3 months from the time an article is written before it gets published. But the only record we have of him owning land in the town of Bethany, in Bethany Wood, is in 1936. Let me turn these lights on so I can read what I'm saying. Thank you. It says, do bark and sell and confirm unto said J.C. Paul and his heirs these 3 certain parcels of land with all improvements thereon. There was nothing. The first parcel, 43 acres more or less, known as Warren land, W, capital L, and I think that has some significance other than, I don't think that was a property owner, I think it meant something else. Situated about 1.5 miles north of Homestead, bounded north in part of land formerly of Many Downs, in part by highway known as Rainbow Road, in part by land now formerly of Justin C. Cole, in part by, and so on. And it describes the first piece of property, the second piece containing 7 acres more or less, woodland situated eastern part of said town, bounded north and so on. And the third piece was the one that's kind of interesting to me. It says, the third piece, being a small parcel of land in the form of a right triangle containing 9 square rods, more or less situated in the eastern part of the town of Bethany. So that was the first time that any record that we could find where he actually owned land in Bethany Wood. We then go to April 1936, and Mr. Howell sells a small parcel, approximately 1 acre of land, and it says, know ye that I, James C. Howell of Salisbury, Connecticut, in the county of Litchfield, state of Connecticut, for consideration of $1, received my full satisfaction of Laura G. Kaiser and Jane L. Brown, both unmarried, of the town of Hampton. And evidently that was a very common term that had to be used in legal documents. An attorney was explaining to me that if you were a woman, somehow there had to be some explanation. You would never find in the tax records a single man, but you would frequently find some reference to women. And then it goes on and says, being a portion of premises designated as Bethany Wood. And this is the first time in April 1936 there's any reference to Bethany Wood in the town records. And then it goes on. Then it goes on and describes the property, and it says, together with a right-of-way for all purposes of travel, such as those incident to any public street or highway in, over, upon land at James C. Howell, known as Woods Road. Again, the first. Said right-of-way being uniform data, and then goes on and explains Woods Road. And then the restrictions. The grantees themselves, their heirs, or assigns forever, by the acceptance, agreed to pay a portionate part of the maintenance of Woods Road, so-called, through its entire extent, in such proportions as the various parcels served by said road bear to the entire road, but not greater than 1/6 of the entire cost of said maintenance computed annually. Now, it's interesting because in the first 4 or 5 years of Bethany Wood, he always puts in that 1/6. So somehow in the back of his mind, I think he thought there were going to be a maximum of 6 houses. Who knows? Said premises are conveyed subject to the following restrictions, which are imposed hereupon for the benefit thereof, and for the remaining premises of grantor, viz., whatever VIC means, that said premises shall be used solely and wholly for residential purposes, that no buildings erected thereupon shall be used for any mercantile, manufacturing, or business purposes, nor shall any spirituous, malt, or intoxicating liquors be sold or kept for sale on said premises, nor shall any livestock, except for this household, have to be kept on said premises, and not more than one family dwelling house shall be erected on said land, and not more than one outbuilding shall be erected thereon, and no building shall be erected within 25 feet of any sideline of said premises. Nothing herewith contained shall be construed as to prevent the erection of a private garage for use in connection with the dwelling house. Said grantor further covenants and agrees that the portion of Bethany Wood lying easterly of a line, 600 feet westerly of a line, shall not be cut up or subdivided. And then the last restriction is, as a part of the consideration of this deed, the grantor hereby for himself, heirs, executors, administrators, assigns, and so on, covenants and agrees that he and they will supply water adequate for building and domestic purposes for the use of the owners or occupants of the building to be erected on the premises first herein described, and that to that end will cause to be constructed pipelines at his own expense in said Woods Road alongside Sullivan. So in April, before, at least as far as we can tell, before anything is built, he sells a piece of property and basically tells the purchaser that there's going to be a road and you have to help pay for it. You can't have a beer parlor or a tavern on your property, and I will supply you water at a reasonable rate. And this is 1936. And earlier I showed you some of the maps. We ended up with 2 wells. The easterly well, which I referred to there, is behind Marie Brown's house, and it's just adjacent to the Loop Road. And the other one is the westerly well that I referred to. Is it behind your house, Lester?
Down and back.
Yeah, and they have access to those. There's right-of-ways. That one has been completely abandoned over the years as the population aged. It used to be that they would take care of and maintain the wells themselves, and then as several residents got older to do it less and less, more residents decided to drill their own wells. So there's only one. The eastern well is still in operation and is somehow taken care of and maintained by Marie Brown. But she's the only one that uses it. That's all we know about. Well, let's see. This is, the next one I have is June 19th. Oh, yes. The next major transaction is in June of 1936. And the only reason I have this is that Mr. James C. Hull sells Foursquare to John Hull. I don't know whether John is a son or a brother. And that was why I wanted to talk to the granddaughter to clarify that. There's no way of knowing. And the only difference is this has the usual restrictions, except that on this one, it says nothing about water rights. But he can't build a tavern on his property. The next one, I'm jumping ahead. There's so much to cover. We could be here till midnight, and I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to try to hit some of the high points. This is November of 1941, and John Howell, who has owned Foursquare, sells Foursquare to Sandy McKenzie. And it has the usual restrictions, except there's a new restriction that's placed on this property. And it says, the premises shall not be used or occupied in any way, whole or part, by any person or persons of Mongolian, Semitic, or Negro racial origin, known or evident within 3 generations. In case of dispute, the burden of proof shall be on the person whose racial origins are in question, but this provision shall not apply to paid household servants in actual attendance as such. Now, that was the first racial restriction that was placed on any of the property, and that was, there was only one piece where this applied, it was in 1941. In April of 1942, in April of 1942, Mr. Howell sells 3 parcels of land to Mel Messer. Mel and Trudy Messer. And parcel 1 being what it goes on and describes it. Basically, maybe I can get there. No, not really. Part of the land that he buys is on the south side of Woods Road, which is where Tuckaway is located. The other 2 parcels on the north side. And the only thing that makes this interesting is that there is a restriction. Oh, let's see, the grantor is subject to the following restrictions. Parcels 1 and 3 shall be used solely and wholly for residential purposes, and parcel 2 for recreation and not for residence. So when he sells the land to the Messers, he's saying, you can build a house here, you can build a house there, but this piece has to be left set aside, which I found kind of interesting. But he has a racial restriction. He does agree to sell the water, and he says the right is reserved to control the 2 ponds on parcel 2 and 3. Those were the significant factors. And the other thing he does is he takes back a mortgage, which is not unusual for Howell to do. He had a lot of times he had mortgages on the various pieces of property, and then there was a note here on the side that it says, release volume 21, page 259, February 22nd, 1943, John Henry, who was our town clerk. The next one is in August of 1952, and this is the piece of property that Mr. Howell sells to Sandy McKenzie that we refer to as Sandy's pasture. And the interesting thing to me was, it's a very large, it's 4.3 acres. It goes from Bethany Wood all the way over to Rainbow Road. It's basically a swamp, really. But it said premises are conveyed subject to the following restrictions, which are imposed hereupon for the benefit thereof without malt, liquor, no building erected within 25 feet, said premises not be occupied by that, and then, but it does say, there is no restriction for livestock. So every other piece of property that he sells in Bethany Wood has you can't have a horse or a cow or a goat. But he sells 4.5 acres to Sandy McKenzie. But if you want horses, you can have horses. It was obvious why Sandy bought the property. In February of 43, you see why every one of these things has a good reason for it.
Is that where the cemetery is?
No, it's between the cemetery, when it goes out on the other end, it's between the cemetery and Hewitt. There's a very, it's like 50 or 150 feet over there. So, but the property is limited to one house, even though it's 3.5 acres. And I don't think any of the owners ever realized that they can only build one house on that piece of property. Okay, this is February of 43. And I just put one of these, but there is a whole slew of them. And it starts out, it says, for $1 and other considerations, George and Sandy McKenzie and Elizabeth McKenzie for $1 sell to Alice E. Howell for $1. They basically sell their property to Alice, and so do the Messrs. 43. That was the Mackenzies, the Gales, I think it is. I can't remember. But anyway, everyone who owns property in Bethany Wood sells to Alice Howell their property for $1. The same day, they sell it all back to their original owners for $1. Now, the racial restriction is part of every deed for every piece of property in Bethany Wood. In 1948, and I don't think I brought that with me, but in 1948 there was a decision by the United States Supreme Court that said you cannot place racial restrictions on property. It's gone. That was in 48. In 1952, we have just the reverse of what we had in 1943, where everybody sells their property. And there is a list of who does it. It's George and it's Sandy and Elizabeth McKenzie. It's the Allens, which they own the property that I own. David Flood, Mel Messer, Ken Littlefield, Ted Wolf, and this was the one that threw me. George Vail. Right, that's exactly the reaction I had. And I'm trying to go, why? Because George had never owned any property in Bethany Wood. But if you go back through the records, at the point when George had a mortgage through Yale, he had his land surveyed. And evidently a common occurrence is if you have your land surveyed, then you go to your adjacent neighbors, and then, like for $1, they agree that this is the land that they both own. You know, this is my site, that's your site, we all agreed to that. But that tied him to Howell. Once it tied him to Howell, this had to untie, even though that restriction was never on any of his property. Well, I just found that was kind of interesting. So in 1952, the racial restrictions are lifted. Let's see. And the rest of it, it just goes on, and what I have are, I think those are the primary, the highlights of what goes on. The only other major thing that I found interesting was that Mr. Howell owned 40-some-odd acres of land. In 1939, a gentleman by the name of Edward Gordon purchased 10 acres of property from the water company. And then the following year, he buys 20-some-odd acres from Howell. So the whole Western Reserve, from the edge of Bethany Wood all the way over to Litchfield Turnpike, that whole big piece of property is now owned by Mr. Gordon. He never builds a single piece, he never builds one house on that entire piece of property. He then sells it back to Mr. Howell in 1941 with the underscore like $3,000, but with the understanding that he has the right to purchase it back from Mr. Howell within 3 years at the same price. But for some reason, he will help pay for the road. But who knows? And 3 years later, Howell sells him back the property. So he now owns all the Western Reserve. And then, I mean, this is a guess. I think there was kind of like a nasty divorce, because you see the property going back and forth between Edward Gordon and Dorothy Gordon. She ends up with all of the property, and she eventually sells the property off to various people over the period of time. But during that whole time, from 1939 to like 1950, when Gordon owned all this property, he never built a single house on it. I just found that interesting. There's one piece that was eventually purchased by Jim Hirschman. It was about a 10-acre parcel. It was the same 10 acres that Gordon had purchased originally from the water company. And in looking at the records and the maps in the town of Bethany, I discovered it was referred to as Bethany Wood Annex. So we now have an annex. Then the parcel had started getting cut up into various pieces and going back and forth. And then your piece of property was, I can't remember, I've got it all down here, but I don't remember. There were other people who came in to be, and then it would be purchased and then cut up and then sold off, and then it ends up looking like that. So there's a lot more, but it's order of nothing. So if anybody has any questions, I'll try to answer them if I can.
How did Howell feel about whether or not his concept was ever achieved?
I think in a way it was. In the early days, I think it was. Because there were more good parties in Bethany Wood than you can shake a stick at. And it expanded beyond Bethany Wood because the Bales were involved in that. Across the street, the Knights were involved. The Turners were very much involved. The Fenningers were involved. It was a very lively community. Culture, all culture. Yeah, when I first moved in, every Christmas, at Christmas time, the kids would all get together, several of the parents, and we would go caroling all the way around through. We'd get up to Glory and we would have to sing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and all the non-Christian songs. And we kept doing it, and then we all went back to the great room and had another great party. They were really a party group, and they had a lot of fun.
Who had the spill? Who had the spill?
Never found it.
You still never found it?
Oh, I will tell you another piece of history that you will not find written anywhere. They also had their own gas station. There was, in Bethany Wood, at some location, and I have no idea where it was,
Don't go
a $1,000 tank was in the ground, and there was a gasoline pump, and evidently it was used up until about 1941. And they put gasoline in, and everybody who lived in Bethany Wood had a key, and you would go down, you'd pump your own gasoline, and you would keep track of how much gasoline you used, and at the end of the period of time, you'd all divvy it up. And after the war started and gasoline was rationed, then the pump disappeared, and that was the end of the gas station. So, let's see if there are any other little...
That must have been down there in the garage.
I'm sorry?
Wouldn't that have been down there in the garage?
It might have been.
Somewhere.
Somewhere. I will tell you this, the tank is no longer in the practice.
Is Bethany Wood still a private road, or is that?
It is a private road.
It's not maintained by the
But the
town?
question is, thank you, who owns it?
Mr. Hall's descendants.
We don't know.
The town doesn't maintain it?
No.
We maintain it, but we do not own it. My property line is up to Bethany Wood Road, but I don't own the road.
I own the road. You know,
Oh, you
said-
do?
As a matter of fact, I do own the road. In my case, it's true. I own
Yes.
across the road
Yep.
and beyond it.
But
The toll gate?
Yeah, you.
told me.
That's a great idea.
The only taxpayer that I know of who owns a road and pays taxes on it, but cannot use the land that he owns. Well, your neighbors do too. The way that Howell laid it out, Woods Road ended up, if I can, let me see if I can do this. Woods Road ended right there. This is Lester here, This is Gloria, and this is the Allens, and then this is Laura. And if you read their deeds, and it says that Woods Road is to be extended across, it's 60 feet wide across the northern part of their property. And then this was owned by the Shaws, and then when they sold that parcel, the cave, to the Devines, it's also on their deed. So Bethany Wood Road theoretically goes up to about there, if I can not shake quite so much. And there's that 60-foot, but you can't build on it because it's kind of like a right-of-way. But you own it, and you pay the town of Bethany taxes on that 60-foot strip. But it's always been, to me, it's very interesting that we have no idea who owns Woods Road. The other thing that was interesting was the garage, and this map is number 34, right there. Now, 1951, I believe it was, Howell sold the garage to Ted Wolf. And then Ted Wolf, and then subsequent, every time it got sold, the garage got sold, but the property was never merged. It was always a separate piece. And that was not a problem until Mr. Harper and family who owned the stone house, they lost it on foreclosure, and Marie Brown allowed them to live in Foursquare. She was living in West Haven at the time. And they lived in Foursquare and owned the garage, and they had a lot of the materials stored in the garage. Eventually, Mr. Howell and Mrs. Howell, Mrs. Harper dies. And then Marie decides to move back to Bethany, and the two Harpers move into New Haven. Now, Dave Harper Jr. has got to have been in his mid-70s at that time. And he moves into New Haven and moves in with his mother. And so he and his son living with his mother for several years until she dies. That property gets sold. He moves to the West Coast with his other son, leaving Doug Howell behind for us to deal with, because he owns the garage, or at least his father does. And it turns it into a trash heap. And for several years, out of lots of frustration, he brings in old cars. He builds a fence around. He's got his own compound. I can't describe to you all of the things that he did. And eventually, Glenn Doole, through a lot of persistence and simply using our regulations and the state regulations, Glenn is able to take him to court and force him to clean up the property because he's in so many violations, which he eventually does, and then he sells the garage to the current owners of the stone house, which are the Rosebud's. So there's some, all these cute little stories along the line.
I know exactly where the gas pump was. When the war started with rationing, my father, being a farmer, had to have a place for gas. So we took over the pump. It was an old crank job, cranked up 4 or 5 gallons and then let it run down. But it was right on that wide corner as you're going out, just before you get to Erwin Steward. I've got one story I've got to tell. I'm over there. I used to deliver eggs. I was 12, 13 years old. And I was walking around the back end up there, and I looked out in the woods, and there's something out there. What the heck is that? I sort of checked it, thought maybe it was a deer or something. It was Mr. Howell. He had a mirror here, a mirror in the tree behind him, and he was cutting his hair. He was a 12, 13-year-old, I was scared. Thank you, Erwin.
mentioned Marion Lane. She sold me my house. On a Sunday afternoon, I happened to see the listing. So by the time we got up to look at it, it was dark. There was no electricity in the house. We went through the house with flashlights. And right then and there, on the basis of walking through a house with flashlights, I made her an offer on the house.
Well, another story about that house. Prior to your purchasing it, there were several actors who were employed by the Yale Repertory Company that were living there. They were renting from Mrs. Shaw's estate, whatever. And I knew them because I graduated from drama school, so I knew a lot of it, and I knew I was teaching part-time at the drama school, so I had gotten to know them. And 2 weeks ago, we went down to see the Gates in New York City, and I was looking through the New York Times while we were down there, and they're doing a production of Waiting for Godot. And the gentleman who originated one of the parts of Waiting for Godot 50 years ago, I can't remember how many years ago it was now playing one of the minor parts in Waiting for Godot, and he was also the same gentleman who was renting the house from Mrs. Shaw.
Do you recall what his name is?
Alvin Epstein.
Alvin Epstein.
We have coffee, dessert, so forth in the back.